Hey, welcome to another episode of the Caroline Glick Show. Last week, we found out that, I think like over a month ago, the Chinese President Xi invited Prime Minister Netanyahu to a state visit in China. It's not quite clear when it's going to happen yet, but what's clear enough is that the Chinese extended the invitation at a time when the Biden administration still can't see way clear to inviting America's most important and most powerful ally in the Middle East, Israel. You can't seem to invite the prime minister to the White House. So the Israeli media, as is its wont, because it's entirely superficial and doesn't understand anything, said that the whole thing about the China visit is just a way to get back at Biden. And I talked about this at length in several television appearances last week here, that Israel has extremely important ties with China, and China itself is an extremely important country for Israel and the region and the world. And as a result of both of those things, both Israeli-Chinese bilateral relations and also China's rising importance in the region, Israel wants to have good relations with China. And regardless, even if Biden had already invited Netanyahu back and forth to the White House 17 times since he assumed office in January, Netanyahu still would have to go to China and meet with Xi, and there's a lot to be done at that meeting. So I thought it was really important to explore the issue of Israeli-Chinese ties and also of Israel's position as a regional power, and finally, China's rising power in the region and its significance for Israel on this show. And the first person that came to mind, and I was thrilled that she was able to join me to have here as my guest, is Carice Witte. Carice Witte, a dozen or so years ago, founded an extremely important organization called the Signal Group, which at least initially has been devoted to expanding Israeli-Chinese academic cooperation, and they've branched out to other issues. So I'm really pleased to welcome you, Carice Witte. Witte, not Wit. It's spelled Witte, pronounced Witte, just like my name is Caroline, spelled Caroline. So everybody has their problems. But so Carice Witte, I'm so glad that you joined me today. So first of all, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's really exciting to be here, my first time.
Yeah, and definitely not the last. So I just want to, first of all, can you explain what it is exactly that the Signal Group does?
Yes.
It's important. It's an important group, and you guys should know all about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So about 13 years ago, it was pretty clear that China was on the rise. It was about to become the second largest economy, and that as a result, it was going to need more energy. It would be moving towards the Middle East, and it decided it was going to become the world's innovators, not just factory. And therefore, I figured it would eventually be coming to Israel because we already were known as an innovation powerhouse. And
it was around that time that the Startup Nation also was published.
That's absolutely right. Exactly right. And so I was also aware, because I had a China background, I studied China at Yale University. I had spent time working in China in the mid-'80s, a very different time and a very different China in many ways, not all. And it was also clear to me that China's understanding of this region was not strong. We're Christians, Muslims, and Jews. And if you think about it, the Chinese come from a totally different background. They're Buddhist, Taoist, communist, atheist. And the one God mentality doesn't really fit into their construct. So how are they going to move into our region and maintain the stability they need for the energy and the innovation if they don't have a solid understanding of what it's like here? So the idea was to reach out to the current and future leaders, the future through the universities. As you mentioned, we established a sort of unconventional academic relationship where we bring Chinese faculty to Israel, they study here, and they go back and teach. And we also
study Israel?
Yes, they go through a master's degree program at Ben Gurion University in stable care. It's in English, and they do only one semester. But because they're already faculty, it gives them a lot of meat in order to be able to teach. And then we help them develop a course that they go back and teach, and it's done, under the administration of the academics at Ben Gurion, who are the experts. So they have a relatively robust ability to go back, given the fact that there are no real experts on Israel, or there weren't at the time. So we work now with about 20 universities. And at the same time, back in 2011, we started working with the policy advisors in Beijing, bringing experts from Israel on regional issues, the Iran problem, or energy, a range of topics of mutual interest. And we would go to Beijing and conduct a series of briefings with institutes of the party and of the government. And we have done that up until COVID. During COVID, it moved online. And now that we're past COVID, we're looking towards going back in October to continue this dialogue.
The level of intensity of those exchanges pre-COVID. I mean, how often were these exchanges going on?
4 or 5 times a year.
Wow.
An official track 2 dialogue twice a year, and then briefings conducted, at least quarterly.
Wow. So that's very intense. Do you have an office in China as well, or just everything is out of
Everything
Israel?
is based here. We do have one coordinator who works with us who's based in Beijing.
Chinese?
She's Chinese, and she's very helpful, but we are centered 100% in Israel, in Ramat Gan.
Do you speak Chinese?
我的中文很不好. My Chinese is
you
not...
You just ordered Chinese food. That's what you...
I actually said my Chinese is very weak because when I moved here, when I made Aliyah, we didn't have official relations with China. 1987. We didn't officially sign that agreement until 1992. Right. And by then, I had long established a way of actually making money and growing a family, which had nothing to do with China. So during the 25 years that I wasn't dealing with China, it's a use it or you lose it language.
So it is. It's not like a bike. All right. So you were telling me ahead of time when we were talking, before we get into Israel-China relations, you said also that in addition to, but what you were telling me sort of goes into where I want to go with the discussion. So you were saying that you've started something called
Global
Israel Initiative.
Correct.
So I think that's a good way to kind of pivot into our discussion. Can you tell me a little bit about what you were doing with that?
Sure. In 2022, looking out at the landscape and seeing that there were a lot of challenges for Israel with China and challenges with Israel with the United States, both extremely important, not equivalent at all, that very clear that it's weighted deeply on the side of the U.S.,
right.
But nonetheless, and a lot of tensions between those two countries. So we started to look out at the world and see that there were a number of extremely important countries in the Indo-Pacific that warranted a relationship with Israel for us and for them mutually beneficial. So we also saw that Israel is effectively a middle power on the global stage, but not acting as one. It has been very regionally oriented all the decades.
So a couple of things just to make clear what you're talking about. So what is a middle power?
A middle power is a smaller country that punches above its weight.
Okay.
And we can easily recognize them. We see Singapore is one of them, and Japan is another. Although Japan might seem large to Israel, it's a middle power, and it manages to take the lead in a number of global...
It was an empire. I mean, it fought the United States.
And so were the Jews.
All right.
But even India is still a middle power. It's moving to be a great power. But Israel's ability to reach past the region, it already exists in technology, in defense
So
sales.
middle power, just to clarify. So we're a regional power because we're very, very powerful. We have a strong economy in our region. But a middle power is somebody with a strong economy, various comparative advantages that make it interesting to countries far away as well. So that it's an actor on the global stage, not only on the regional stage.
That's right, with only one small caveat that you take the initiative to act on the global stage.
Okay.
So we would be able to reach out to countries far outside our region where we have shared interests and together develop those interests in ways that affect both, whatever that region may be it in the South China Sea and the Middle East or whatever.
Because, this is basically how Prime Minister Netanyahu envisions Israel. His foreign policy in his previous term of office that began in 2015 in particular was marked by his unprecedented outreach. He went to all over the world. He went to Australia. He went to Argentina. He went to countries that haven't seen a prime ministerial visit either ever or in decades. And so all of these nodes, all these geographical nodes, he was going to those countries. I think he might even, did he go to Chile? I don't remember, but he went to all of the countries in Africa, massively expanded Israel's presence in that continent. So, he definitely sees Israel as an actor that has something to give, not just the countries of the region, but the countries of the world.
Fully agree. Absolutely. And he laid a lot of important groundwork, and I'm sure the government, when it has the bandwidth, is going to be pursuing that. But as a nation, we're not yet there.
Mm-hmm.
And we want to make our small contribution through the access that we've cultivated over the years working directly with China, and since 2019 building a network of China and foreign policy experts globally, which we have done through conducting a number of online events on a very consistent basis, and unite that power in order to work with countries in the Indo-Pacific, bring in countries from the Middle East where relevant, Abraham Accord countries, etc., and Europe, and of course China and the U.S. where relevant, but mainly to focus on Japan, Australia.
And our peer nations.
That's right. And there are many areas where I think once we start digging, we'll find a lot of shared interests where we can put together different constellations of countries that want to work together, with Israel taking the initiative. And this is extremely important because we see the pressure on Israel growing, again, from the side of China with the Iran-Saudi deal, from the side of America with another, as you mentioned, there's a lot of dissonance between the U.S. government and our current government. And it would behoove us to take our energies and focus them on areas where we can make some positive difference.
I think that that's a very, very key insight. And let's just pivot from there for a second to what you were talking about with China in the region and its relationship first with Iran, and then its growing presence in the Persian Gulf, in its adjudication of the dispute between, or mediation of the dispute between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and how we're supposed to be looking at China's rise. On the one hand, it signed a strategic alliance, essentially, and a strategic cooperation deal with Iran that gives it a lot of equities inside of Iran a few years ago. I think it's a 25-year deal. And then now it's just everywhere, signing deals and expanding, deepening its ties with Saudi Arabia and with the UAE and other countries. So let's start first with the China-Iran issue.
Okay, so Israel has been trying to work with China to rein in Iran for probably 30 years, and it has made very little headway as far as we know. At the same time, China has said extremely consistently, and I think quite believably, they have no interest in Iran gaining nuclear military capability. They're working with Iran partly because they get some benefits, but also because Iran is sort of the last line of defense for the hegemonic democracy known as America that they don't want reaching their shores. They went through that 100 years or more than 100 years ago, had 100 years of humiliation, and they are still licking their wounds. And
the Chinese
trying to overcome that. So Iran, the actual relationship between Iran and China is not what it might seem from the public statements. There's a lot of difficulty that the Chinese find in working with the Iranians. The Iranians resent the Chinese for taking advantage of the sanctions and being able to access a lot of energy at low cost, et cetera, et cetera. So the relationship is not, it's called a comprehensive strategic partnership. And yes, they have what is called a 25-year, $400 billion deal, but how much of that money has actually been invested in Iran is probably extremely limited. And Iran is probably getting more money from the United States releasing funds than from China. But China is present, as you noted, in the Middle East. Since 2016, it's been the largest investor in the Middle East. Iraq became, a few years ago, the top 3 recipient of Belt and Road investment in the world. And
before them?
I don't know.
Okay.
Sorry. Because they're not in the Middle East.
There you go.
But that was actually a surprise to many. And it's obviously Iraq needs a lot of reconstruction. And what's very unique about Iraq is that it has the energy to pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason you don't see China reconstructing Syria or Lebanon is because they can't pay for it. So we find that China has been very successful in bringing its digital technology to the Middle East. All the countries except Israel have been relatively welcoming of Huawei's 5G telecom technology, which was a concern by the United States that it would allow a backdoor for information to be transmitted back to China. And the countries of the Middle East have less concern about that. Israel was never going to consider it. It was never a possibility, and we don't work with Huawei in that way. However, you see China developing smart and safe cities like Neom from scratch.
Neom is Saudi Arabia's city of the future, right across from Israel.
Exactly right. And also Egypt, the new capital, is being built by China.
And how is Egypt paying for that? They don't have any money.
Yes, Egypt has done. They have a lot of a complex relationship with China, and I think that the support that they get from China is very welcomed by Israel, certainly, because they're we don't want to see that country cave in and disintegrate, and China contributes in a positive way, and China makes many positive contributions across the Middle East. I think what Israel needs to do, though, is be aware of what is happening and ensure that that it is able to address whatever may come along that is not necessarily a positive for Israel or becomes a challenge to Israel. And one of the things that is concerning is that there is growing high-end, cutting-edge technological development between China and the UAE. That's an Abraham Accord partner of Israel. Israel does high-end technology development with the UAE. And we've seen in that relationship where the UAE is willing to say to the United States, we will call your, we will choose 5G by Huawei over F-35s. And that shows that in that triangle of China, UAE, Israel, the one who will be most affected and the one who will, you could call it the weakest link, and would have to pull back first from business deals that are done in the UAE will be Israel. And so we have to ask ourselves, how is China's growing role in the Gulf and the wider Middle East going to affect the Abraham Accords going forward? Will it be neutral? Will there be negative effects? And how will Israel adapt?
So it really depends on how you construe the Abraham Accords, right? Because the question is, are the Abraham Accords and David Friedman was on the show a couple of weeks ago, and he was explaining that the Abraham Accords is basically like a triangle, and the base of the triangle is Israel and the Arab states, and that the top of the triangle is the United States, and that the United States brought these two sides together. And maybe on a diplomatic level that's true, but not on a level of operational cooperation or even necessarily of business ties. And really the question then becomes, is it, so the other perception of the Abraham Accords is that you had bilateral relations that were informal between Israel and these Arab states, and through U.S. support for both, they were brought above board as a U.S. peace treaty, but that the peace or the cooperative relations and the peaceful relations that already that already existed in the absence of a formal normalized relationship. So if you look at it from the former perspective, then the longevity of the ties is constrained by the United States and the depth of the ties. And then if you look at it from the latter perspective, they're less constrained. So where do you see it?
I think it's a matter of interests.
Okay.
Straight interests. And I think the UAE was signed a free trade agreement with Israel in 4 months because it shared interests. We've been working on a free trade agreement with China since 2016. Still not done.
Same thing with India and South Korea. I think that South Korea was an obnoxious free trade agreement that was finally concluded. Very, very hostile to Israel in a lot of different ways.
So I think that the UAE and Israel had a lot of shared interests. I think security is one of them. I think that's one of the questions that is raised by the Saudi-Iran deal for Israel is the degree to which the UAE is trying to hedge its security interests, through Saudi Arabia. I mean,
well, that's the question. How do you look then at the Saudi-Iranian Chinese accord?
I will get to that in 1 sec. I just want to finish this point. The issue with the technology development in the UAE is about tech transfer, and the degree to which the technology that's being developed is, if it happens to end up with China, does that violate any security interest for Israel? Does it violate any security interest for Israel's ally, the United States?
But how can you separate? I mean, if that's the other problem with all of these countries that are essentially bringing Chinese technology into their DNA through the AI and through Huawei and 5G technologies, how can you? Those things are becoming increasingly difficult to separate out. So if you want to have, I mean, what really is then in the works is, are you going to have just a split in all business dealings in the world between people who are using Chinese technology and people who are not? Because, I mean, it just doesn't seem doable, really.
Well, on the surface, because that's what I would have to look at being a non-tech person, I would have to agree with you. When we're talking about joint technology development, I think it very much depends on what it is. What is that technology? And if there is zero military possibility use of that, then it's fine. And if there is, then I think it hits the territory you're talking about, which is, a 0-1 binary choice, and makes it very difficult for Israel. And I suppose for the UAE to some extent, but the UAE can make choices. When we're talking about the Iran-Saudi agreement, we have to remember that Saudi Arabia brought this almost done deal to the Chinese and said, please wrap this up with a pretty bow, because there are two reasons. One, as we mentioned earlier, China has gives a lot of technological support and input to Saudi Arabia, which supports its Vision 2030 and its futuristic hopes for the country. At the same time, China is a big investor, is practically a monopoly buyer of Saudi oil, and Saudi Arabia is interested in major investments, oil and beyond, in China. So they have a lot of mutual interests. The other side of that coin is that Saudi Arabia is aware that Iran is extremely dependent on China, and there's less chance, at least the assumption was, there would be less chance that Iran would disrupt or violate the agreement if it meant China losing face, China becoming upset, angry, etc., because Iran needs China. So there was a number of reasons why China offered a better brokerage venue than anyone else. Why
did they need a broker to begin with?
Well,
just because they wanted a guarantor of the agreement.
Yeah, I think given the history, there were a lot of basic reasons for that. What that ended up doing is, I mean, on the face of it, and the first reactions were, okay, the Chinese can't really enforce it. It doesn't have a lot of teeth. It may or may not fly, may or may not last. If it does, great. If it doesn't, what did we lose? The fact of it was really the power of it. It put wind in China's diplomatic sails. It's the first real deal, serious deal that China's ever succeeded in concluding. And they did it in one of the most complex venues, which is the Middle East. This put wind in Iran's sails that it seemed to feel the ability to then come out publicly and say that just after the UAE froze its membership in the combined military force in the Indo-Pacific of something like 38 countries. So Iran...
The U.S.-led military force in the Indo-Pacific.
Correct. And just days later, Iran says, we're going to lead a joint naval defense force with our friends in the Gulf and India and Pakistan. Now, whether or not that ever happens, and it probably won't, the fact that they had that they felt comfortable going public with such a major statement, I think is because of the sense that they have China behind them, that this was a very public, successful agreement. And then I can't make a direct line between the dots, but I think we should notice that Israel was attacked on 3 fronts for the first time in over a decade. So it gave wind to Iran, but also China picked up the Qin Gang, the foreign minister of China, picked up the phone for the first time ever, and to our foreign minister and to the Palestinian Authority foreign minister, and said, we are now ready to help you solve the Palestinian conflict and take it to the United Nations to be adjudicated by the international community. And you and your audience well know how welcome Israel is in the United Nations and how the votes go.
Meantime, Xi had Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, the PA leader, in Beijing a week and a half ago for an official visit.
Exactly, following up on that phone call in order to discuss how China could now become the broker for the Palestinian conflict. And this creates complexities for Israel, and I think also for the United States, which I don't know how much either one is paying attention to this whole process, because they rightly say it's never going to happen because we're in charge of it, we the Americans, and Israel has a say. However, there's a process, and through the process that the Chinese lead, it's very hard to know what will evolve. But we can pretty much assume that history has shown us China. It's not the first time China has made this recommendation. It's just the most public, most official. For the past 5 years, they've been holding Palestinian-Israeli talks with people who are not in a position to make official decisions.
What, like Track 2 negotiations?
They don't call them Track 2. They're hosted by Wang Yi. They're called peace talks.
Who's Wang Yi?
Wang Yi he was the foreign minister of China. Now he's the top diplomat. He's the foreign minister of the party, which is above the foreign minister of the government. Okay. And so he, which is almost the highest standing you can get, hosts Israelis who are either think tankers. I think the most recent one was a couple of years ago, and there was an official in the opposition, politician from the opposition who participated. And so these discussions have been taking place. I don't remember his name. And
are they senior opposition leaders or?
No. And the aim is to show, China's aim is to show that it is a peacemaker, and that the global South, of which China sees itself as the leader, which Xi Jinping says, when Biden called all the democracies together, he said, Xi Jinping to and I'm paraphrasing, but you may consider yourself the leader of the developed world. That's about 36 countries. But I head the global South, the developing world, which is over 130 countries. It's a numbers game. And that's why we see that China is very interested in promoting the United Nations as a venue for addressing a variety of issues. For Israel, this is not
as an automatic majority.
I wouldn't say it's automatic, but it's been cultivating good relations with many countries and is the largest trading partner with many countries, and is aware of the value of that when they are looking to protect their own interests, for example, in Western China or in developments with Hong Kong that took place during COVID. And for Israel, this is not a good solution. And I want to just mention that last year or during the past year, President Xi Jinping has come out with 3 very important initiatives that are designed to reshape global governance in a way that is more conducive to the Chinese system and more recognize Chinese role on the global stage. One is the Global Development Initiative, which is basically designed to been propounded to help the United Nations reach its development goals, and it's received a lot of positive support. The second is the Global Civilization Initiative, and it discusses the definition of human rights, the definition of democracy from the perspective of China, and recognizes civilizations, the ancient.
Israel should do well in that, right? I mean, we're an ancient civilization.
Not all about not everything is about Israel. I think this has more to do with the United States.
Right. It's a way of undermining America.
Then there is the one that I think Israel needs to pay the most attention to is the Global Security Initiative, which when after President Xi announced it at the BOA conference last year, head of foreign affairs Wang Yi said, and this can be the new security architecture for the Middle East. And given the fact that we know that China, on the one hand, wants to see stability in this region and wants to contribute in a positive way at the same time, it does lean towards the Palestinians politically. It always has, and it's very clear about that. So we should also recognize that this global security initiative includes indivisible security, or what the Chinese are calling common security. It was indivisible security was originally broached in Helsinki, and it basically says that no country can advance its security if it impinges on the security of another country. And that was Putin's justification for invading Ukraine now, because of NATO was supposedly perceived as impinging on Russia's security, so that justified the invasion. What we need to understand is that global security initiative has been embedded into the Saudi-Iran deal, and it's in the language of the Saudi-Iran deal. It talks about being in the framework of the Global Security Initiative. And that Global Security Initiative is being included in many opportunities for agreements that are being developed between China and other countries. And it is also expected to be a foundational document that would be part of any agreement the Chinese might work towards for the Palestinian-Israeli.
So before we go into, I want to pivot from here to the nature of Israel-Chinese ties. But before we do that, just there's a lot to take on. And I was just thinking, every time that Blinken or any senior or middle-level Biden administration officials, sniffs his nose in Israel's direction, it's front-page news here. And yet, I followed the news fairly closely, and I wasn't even aware of these Middle East negotiations that the Chinese are leading and have been for some time. So that's pretty amazing. So when you give all this information, my first question is, how is America handling this? So he just unpackaged these 3 initiatives. Has the United States developed any coherent, assertive response, counter to what China is doing? Where do you see that?
Well, we just returned from a visit to Washington where we had 20 or 30 discussions with State Department, Congress, and think tanks about these issues. And the United States is still developing its China strategy overall. It is not, from what we can see, it's not yet addressing the new initiatives. One must be careful about whack-a-mole because, as you mentioned, China is everywhere. It is. It's an amazing country. It has achieved enormous success. When you think about where it was and when I was there in the mid-'80s, there was no food. I could not get my hands on a piece of protein. I was lucky to get some tofu every now and then, root vegetables on the mainland of China, unless for maybe there was one or two restaurants in Beijing that had more to offer. This was just post-Cultural Revolution, just a few years after, and China has raised 800 million people out of abject poverty. They've created a 400 million person middle class. They've really done outstanding things for their people and beyond. At the same time, China's current leader is taking China in a more controlled direction. And, we watched what happened with Hong Kong. There was a 50-year agreement, and seemed out of the blue, but certainly 25 years early, that one China, two systems agreement was cut off at the knees. And many other steps were taken domestically that cause a different understanding of the direction of China, that it is not as open as it was. There are many limitations. For example, we host faculty, as I mentioned to you. Now, fewer faculty we still are hosting them. We had 7 last year, which was practically a record. But this year, we will have only 3 because there's a new, it's not an official policy, but it's an interpretation of a policy that is concerned with international foreign interference. And foreign interference being foreign ideas. And I think, if you want to understand it, you could say in the religious community, they want to keep some certain level of a lid on that community and keep it somewhat internal so that its people are not too much exposed to the outside world, because there are a lot of temptations that could lead in a negative way. I think it's something similar to that, and on a very national level. There also have been a lot of changes in the economy. The economy...
It's a downturn.
Yeah, terrible downturn. In 2021, Xi Jinping made a lot of policy economic choices that caused disruption of the economy in real estate, in internet technology, in after-school education, completely wiped out all after-school education overnight, hundreds of thousands of jobs, billions of dollars. And then COVID zero, and now the post-COVID zero fallout, the slowing global economy, and China's economy is in a very difficult situation. So all of these things are leading to sort of a kind of closure, an internal closure, that means that when we're looking at our relationship with China, we don't have as much freedom. No scholar has as much freedom to communicate with the Chinese, to have access to China. Although you can go there, there are many people who are many China scholars who are choosing not to go. Archives are not available. And so, the relationship with China must evolve.
But the Americans just haven't. I mean, a lot of times I say that the Americans continue to think that it's 1991, 1992. They just won the Cold War, and things aren't shifting the way that they are. So that I get the sense in so many different areas or arenas, including in Europe, that the United States still hasn't gotten its arms around the fact that the ground shifts and that people who were once down are much more powerful than they were yesterday. And when you talk about the depth of the Chinese investment economically, technologically, in these Middle Eastern countries, and Saudi Arabia first and foremost, which is the foremost U.S. ally in the Middle East. And here they have their 2020 vision for the Saudi future. and it's being built by China. I mean, you would have thought, 20 years ago, it would never have occurred to you that anybody other than Halliburton and whomever the American contractors are would be building China, the new city in Saudi Arabia, the city of the future of Saudi Arabia. But here, the United States I don't think it was even involved with the bidding process. But I don't know. It's just we're nowhere.
America doesn't make much anymore. It hasn't for a while. I think we can talk for another hour about the failures of American economic industrial planning. But America is aware of, and has been aware for years of China's development, China's involvement, China's global presence. It has its own problems. It's busy with a lot of different things. It's the focus on China only started seriously with Trump. There was a lot of thought before that and questioning about what would be the best way to advance relations with China. And there was still hope that China was going to become more like the United States, which is a mistake to ever think such a thing. If you study Chinese culture, you know that's not possible. But this has been a long, slow, moving and evolving relationship and awakening for the U.S. The U.S. was first to see China as a challenge. Europe followed. Israel does have points where China is a challenge and where China is important. And I think that's true for every single country. And the U.S. is working on how to deal with it. But it's the first time there's ever been a non-Western
power.
Yeah, a non-Western thinking, Western styled
peer.
Exactly. Ever in modern history. No one who is alive today knows what the world would look like with an Eastern power running the global system.
So let's move then to our middle power, to Israel and Sino-Israeli ties. So I know that now China has, I was looking at the data, and I'm sorry I didn't bring it with me so that I could quote it as if I would remember it by heart. But, China's trade with Israel has increased very, very quickly. Now the trade gap, though, we have a trade deficit with them that continues to grow. I think largely, and it's not necessarily that much of a concern. It's mainly because Israelis like to buy their clothes from Alibaba and Shein. But they're massively exporting now to Israel. Israel exports I think we're a bit down, but they're our second largest trading partner after the United States. Obviously, cumulatively, Europe remains Israel's largest trading partner, but China is moving up there fairly rapidly. But how do you give me sort of a 360 on Israeli-Chinese ties, where they stand today?
China is less of a player for Israel now than it was 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. It was a larger investor in technology, in startups, in venture capital.
In infrastructure.
It was a serious player up until relatively recently, over the last, I would say, year and a half, 2 years.
That was with the Trump administration. They were supposed to build a railroad, a really important project. I hope somebody builds it, between Eilat and Ashdod, that was going to be an alternative route for maritime traffic to bypass the Suez Canal.
Well, that's quite complicated because the Eilat port, the harbor, isn't deep enough. So there would be a lot of ecological damage if it was dug out in order to bring the kind of ships that would make all of that relevant. But for infrastructure, China was able to bid the lowest and give good quality product, but due to a variety of reasons, probably some of which is due to American...
A lot of it is American pressure.
It seems that the Chinese are getting fewer and fewer contracts. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, they are still getting contracts. They're still here. They're still working. The Chinese are still investing, but less. And the trade, as you noted, it's not a strategic issue at all. And I think that what's important for Israel is, we're a small economy compared to the Middle East. The trade is in the, $280 billion range for the Middle East. No, it was $280 billion in the Middle East, and we're talking about around $14 billion with Israel. So we're tiny by comparison to the benefits of working with the other countries in the Middle East. And I think for us, the main goal is
it's up to 18 billion,
perhaps,
but still a rounding error.
And well, the point is that the gap between us and the Middle East is vast, and the Chinese have an easier time selling into the other countries of the Middle East in general. So it's important that we continue trade, that China continues to bid and get some contracts in Israel, and that the relationship continues to grow in a way that benefits both countries. I think the days, in 2018, there were scores and scores of Chinese business people coming every month and looking at investing, and the percentage of investment in comparison to the amount of energy and time spent on hosting and displaying and demonstrating was so weak that Israel suffered China fatigue. And then the trade war had impact, and
the U.S.-China
trade war impacted Israel, where Israel started to all the tech companies and businesses started to self-censor. If I want to do business in China, I better not take American money. If I want to do business in America, vice versa. So you see a kind of divide created internally of its own accord in acknowledgement of the greater geopolitical setting. So relations with China are good overall. There are no
from trade. Do we have we have your academic exchange?
Universities are working. There are many.
I heard that Technion has a larger campus in China than they have in Haifa.
It's possible, but if you look at the numbers of China, that would be
pretty easy to understand.
But also
many students in China.
11 million graduated this past
an Israeli professor in China. He just has vastly more students than.
Yes. So there are many Chinese students at the Technion in Israel, and many in Tel Aviv and Hebrew U, et cetera, et cetera. And there are a few Israelis studying in China, but it's been very difficult to get to China. So I don't think that's 100% due to lack of interest, but more due to, just the recent history that China has been not very accessible. There are other kinds of exchanges with China, but it's minor, and I think that the impact of the U.S. view of China could be seeping into the wider community. Nonetheless, it's important that we maintain good relations with China. It's, as you noted at the outset of this discussion, it is a rising superpower. It is currently a major power, and it will be it will be in our lives for, the foreseeable future in serious ways.
So I look at, we have a common friend, David Goldman, who I know does a lot of work with you with Signal, and so he had, I don't remember whether it was in a private conversation or whether he was here on the show, but I think I can say it because he hasn't hidden this view at all. But he said, look, Benjamin Netanyahu has a very clear message that he has to give to Xi Jinping, which is, look, nice economy, you got there, it'd be a shame if something happened to it. You have economic interests in stability in the Middle East. And if you stand by and allow Iran to become a nuclear weapons-wielding state, then Israel's going to have to attack it. And your interests are going to be harmed by this. And, you have your economic interests. We also do. We also have our existential interests. And, this is what you can expect if this is allowed to happen. So, have a nice day, right? And that was his suggestion of what a proper agenda would be for a Netanyahu-Xi meeting. What do you make of that?
Right. So we brought this exact message to Xi's policy advisors back in 2013. And it's not on, you said it's economic interests for China. It's existential. If there were a conflagration in this region that's dropped the flow of oil by enough, probably 6-7%, to cause the price of oil to go to $300 a barrel, that's existential for China. Okay. So China and Israel share an existential interest in stability in this region. But there's a couple of issues. First of all, it's a very good point that it's the leadership of China should understand that if Israel feels that's what it needs to do in order to survive, that's what we'll do. At the same time, the Chinese have watched Israel be controlled by the United States in a lot of different ways. In 2000, 2004, it was to not carry out the Harpy drone repair and to keep it, and before that to not complete the sale of the AWACS. Exactly. And then when it was made clear by the Netanyahu government that the message you just outlined, Obama then took steps that made it very clear that he was tying Bibi's hands. So that is a wonderful message to give if you can stand by it. But knowing that the Americans are in the background and can always rein in Israel, one wonders how much the Chinese would take that seriously.
So that goes back to my long-standing position that to survive and also to rebuild America's or Israel's strategic position vis-a-vis the United States, Israel has to demonstrate strategic independence when it comes to Iran, and I would argue also with relation to the Palestinians, that the more powerful Israel presents itself to be, the more respect it will command from the United States and by what you say as well from China. So then under these circumstances, then what's the point of going to Beijing?
Oh, there are a lot of very serious issues, and I think it's very important for our Prime Minister to go. He can and should discuss Iran regardless. I do believe that behind the scenes, the Chinese exercise influence because it is in their interest. They will not do it publicly for a lot of reasons, but it's my personal belief that behind the scenes they do. And keeping the message clear on this subject can only help. There's also the Palestinian issue, a discussion about where Israel stands and the stand Israel will take in order to defend our security, and how that relationship needs to be managed, and to perhaps set some parameters with the Chinese with respect to how they're looking to become influencers in this diplomatic arena, and then talk about perhaps the Saudi-Iran deal and what kind of impact that might have had in the regional security and of Iran's interests in, that we have seen through its proxies, which tend to only expand. There's also a very important factor of bringing Israel's solutions to China. We still can do good business together. For example, China suffers from massive flash droughts. Mm-hmm. They have
already doing water cooperation with them,
very little, and they have massive problems. Israel is the water solution center of the planet, and there are, for example, in Yunnan province, all the hydroelectric plants have come to a stop, which they provide the energy for Shenzhen and Guangzhou, which are the places you talked about, Israelis buying all that stuff. That's where that stuff is made. And it is the manufacturing center of China. They don't have energy because they don't have rain, which means there's not enough water for agriculture, water for drinking. Israel has solutions. That this is a topic that and not to mention agricultural technology. Food security is a top priority for China. This is another area which is completely benign when it comes to concerns by the United States or any kind of security question. And these can be discussed and solutions can be brought. And then there are wider strategic issues which our Prime Minister can raise with China's president. And remembering China's growing global role, Israel must be there. Israel should visit, but it should be done without mystery and without a clouded vision for the people of Israel, so that we can understand why and what and when and how.
Okay, so then a couple more aspects to that before we start rounding it out, which is, you mentioned the civilizational thing, their initiative of the Alliance of Civilizations or whatever it's called. The Americans actually, and Khamenei or Khatami, Mohammed Khatami, he had this idea of an alliance of civilizations. I remember this like back in the 1990s for Iran. But the truth is that, Israel is an ancient civilization. The Jewish civilization is a teeny tiny one, but it's certainly influential in the history of the world, and it still exists just like the Chinese civilization does. So one of the things I'm wondering in terms of developing ties with China is how you were saying that China will never be like the United States because it's just so different and it has so many different the historical antecedents of everything that we see are so deep and ingrained in the character of that very enormous nation. But can you have that kind of a dialogue that impresses upon the Chinese the fact that we're both ancient civilizations in a manner that will make any difference in the real world? Or is that just, are they influenced in their thinking by larger philosophical issues, or is it all just very, transactional? How does that work?
Well, there's a lot. Xi Jinping has brought much more ideology into the running of China. And it's internal, and that's very significant. However, when
is that Chinese or is that communist? Is ideological?
I would say it's socialism with Chinese characteristics. I think that's also what Xi Jinping calls it.
Okay.
And Xi Jinping thought. He has his philosophy of diplomacy, of economy, of education, everything. And Xi Jinping thought is taught in all schools. He has textbooks from grammar school up. All of the party must study Xi Jinping thought. And so ideology has become very, very important. However, when it comes to dealing with the world, it's not about ideology. And yes, China recognizes Israel as a civilization and respects it as a civilization. But when you're looking at one Jewish state in the face of 56 Muslim states, and you're looking at votes and the numbers game, it doesn't matter what civilization, how great your civilization is, how old it is, and how much it has contributed. China would like to see Israel thrive, I am sure. But if it's necessary, if China feels it's necessary to throw Israel under the bus to advance China's interests, well, that's the way it goes.
So that's the other thing. You think, because, it really just speaks to the limited nature of the potential then for Israeli-Chinese ties, because if China views its dominant position in the middle in the United Nations as a strategic asset that it's wielding in its competition with the United States, among other things, then really their tendency to throw Israel under the bus is rather high, isn't it?
I really can't say that its tendency is high at all. I think that it just is an option that will be used when it feels it's necessary. And just like it will use all other kinds of options with all other kinds of countries in order to advance its own interests, because it feels that it is surrounded. There are U.S. military bases in its near abroad. And if you look at it from Chinese perspective, the U.S. is trying to keep China down, prevent it from growing, doesn't want it to succeed because it would take over the U.S. #1 position, given that you have 350 million hardworking Chinese people and you have an export economy that has so much foreign exchange that it can take a massive lead on investment globally, which is what we have seen. I don't know what will be in the near future given China's weaker economy, but they still have very high reserves, supposedly higher than what is officially listed. And China is going to advance its interests as it should. And America advances its interests as it should. And the only thing I want to conclude by saying is Israel should advance its interests as it should.
Where we began, which is what you were talking about with Signal's new initiative of Israel as a middle power. So that when you look, I hate using the analogy of a chessboard, both because I don't play chess and also because it's so overused. But I mean, there are these. It's a very complicated world. And at the same time, it's for Israel looking out, it's also a very hostile world. And whether it's at the UN, where you have a massive automatic majority against us, or whether it's in Iran and its satellite states, and the increased opposition to Israel in the West, with the sort of cultural Marxism that views Zionism as a form of racism that's really taking hold even, in the United States. So when you look at the situation, but you also see Israel as a middle power, how do you see Israel as a middle power being better able to navigate this very dangerous world that we're facing today than what it's doing now?
Well, you paint a gloomy picture, but it isn't. I would not agree that that is the full picture, because India, for example, 1.4 billion people, which are actually now has a larger population than China, and it will continue. The two will continue on that trajectory.
And they have a middle class that's something along the lines of 300 million people as well.
Yes. And they have a tremendously powerful diaspora. It's very funny. We talk about 1 million Chinese in the Middle East. Wow. There are 10 million Indians in the Middle East, just in the Middle East. Not to mention the head of Google, and an ethnic Indian is the Prime Minister of the UK, and Indians are running top companies around the world.
Is an ethnic Indian running for president.
Exactly. So they love Israel. It's been evolving over the last 15 years, and I will say that the images of our prime minister at the beach with Modi had affected the peasants, the people. In Gujarat, all over it, from the north to the south. You go out into the countryside. We actually had an Indian analyst in our office this morning giving a talk, and he mentioned that you ask about Israel, and people actually know Israel and have a positive feeling about it, in part because of that, and of course in part because Israel is a major defense supplier, and I2U2, which is the Israel, UAE, USA, India mini quad, you could call it, which is developing different kinds of economic and technological ties. And then you go to South Korea, where studying Talmud is a huge thing. And they very welcome the Jews and the Israelis. And Japan has invested recently $3 billion in Israel, and it's only growing. So that's just a few of the Indo-Pacific countries that, as you mentioned, Netanyahu began to open doors. And we should continue to explore and strengthen those ties, which gives us a lot of other options. And I think that's where we should be putting our energies.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I brought you in to talk about Israel-China, but with your global Israel initiatives, I think that you pivoted to China at a key moment, and I think that the out pivot that you're doing now, a signal to the wider Indo-Pacific region, is so critical. And so, first of all, I want to thank you for coming in, and second of all, I want to thank you for what you do.
Well, thank you. I need to just make it clear. We, Signal, will continue to work closely with China. We'll continue to do our policy work and our academic work. We're expanding to the Indo-Pacific because we really felt that as China goes global, we should too.
Right.
And so we hope to be able to do it all. And I want to thank you so much for giving me so much time to explain and discuss all these complex issues.
I think I'm going to have to have you back again. And because like I said, I didn't even know that China was mediating peace talks between us and the Palestinians. So just for that little tiny, nugget of information, it was worth having you. But you've given us so much more. So I appreciate so much your coming and your time. And thank you, guys. And we'll be back next week to talk about the key issues that are going on here in the Middle East and in Israel. So we'll see you then. Again, thank you so much, Carice.
Thank you. Bye-bye.